Well, good morning and welcome back to the show. This is Bronwyn and welcome to Voice to the Voiceless, sponsored by 313 Network Solutions. Come check us out. Today, I want to talk about shattered bonds. Black women, incarceration, and their healing, and our healing. So, we're going to take a deeper dive into this topic. I feel it's urgent and very much overlooked. The reason I feel this way is because the incarceration of Black women, no one sees the deep trauma that is connected to it. No one recognizes the ripple effect that it has on families and communities. You know, um, incarceration in itself of anybody, especially women, affects families and communities. But it reaches a whole nother of devastation in Black communities where the majority of families are run by single mothers. So let's dive off into some of this. And I want to emphasize that this episode is not just about the numbers, it's about the lives. And I'm not sure if any of you have heard some of my other podcasts where I share my life story and my journey, and the fact that I spent 10 years incarcerated as a first time offender, uh, and some of the impact that happened with my family, my children especially, and 20 plus years later, almost 30 years, that effect, that ripple is still being felt in each one of us with different perspectives. So check those out. So again, this episode is not about the numbers, it's about the lives. The daughters, the mothers, the sisters, the grandmothers who are behind bars, and what that means for generations connected to them. We'll explore trauma, systematic racism, family separation, and healing. And before we close, I'll share some resources and some action steps. I will go back and put the resources in the description. So let's look at the scope of the problem. Black women are incarcerated at nearly twice the rate of white women. According to the Sentencing Project, while Black women make up 13% of the females in the U.S. population, they represent nearly 30% of women in prison. Well, it's only 13% of us in the whole population, and 30% of that is in prison. The math ain't mathing. Most are not in for violent crimes. Instead, the majority are serving time for drug-related charges, survival crimes tied to poverty, or for defending themselves against abuse. And there's the heartbreaking truth. Up to 90% of incarcerated women have survived physical and or sexual violence before prison. 90% of the women have survived physical and or sexual violence before prison. So when we talk about Black women in prison, we're talking about survivors of trauma who are being re-traumatized inside cages. That is so very true. The trauma of being inside prison is compounded onto the trauma we've already experienced. So let's talk about the trauma a little closer. Childhood trauma, domestic violence, sexual abuse, community violence. These are realities disappropriately affecting Black women. We live with this every day, and we have been living with it all of our lives, from childhood up. A lot of it comes from poverty and the disparities in races. The Bureau of Justice Statistics found that 3 out of 4 incarcerated women report severe physical abuse before their imprisonment. 3 out of 4. So 75 women out of every 100 women talk about being beat. And the other 25%, some of them may have watched the domestic violence or the violence in their family as children and connected that with that's normal. I know certain things that went on in my childhood and the family I thought was normal because it was happening in my family. Back to reporting the reported physical abuse. So instead of being offered therapy, absolutely, there's no therapy in prison or safety. There's very little therapy outside of prison for violence, physical abuse, domestic violence. All the resources is just tapped out, and there's not a lot of funding for it in the beginning. Instead of being offered therapy and safety, many were punished, criminalized for surviving. For surviving. Think about that. A survivor of abuse punished by the state. That's what we mean when we talk about systematic re-traumatization. In my journey, During my 10 years, I met several women who were there for harming their abuser. That was my story. I was there for harming my abuser. Many were there because they had an abuser that had so much control and power that they did things that they knew were wrong to keep from being physically harmed. And they ended up in prison. Prison doesn't solve trauma, it multiplies it. I'm going to repeat that. Prison doesn't solve trauma, it repeats it. Okay, let's talk about the family dynamics and the generational impact. Another level of trauma. When a Black woman is incarcerated, the punishment doesn't stop with her, it ripples outward. Over 80% of incarcerated women are mothers. And I mentioned this earlier. And most of those mothers are the primary caregivers for those children. Blam, mic drop. That means incarceration doesn't just lock up one person, it tears apart a household. It breaks family bonds and it pushes children into cycles of trauma. Many children end up in the foster care system. They end up in how different types of housing programs and other type of programs for children, because the abuse in the foster care system causes them to run away or become delinquent, and then they end up in youth homes and other mental facilities for children. And now here in Michigan, I've been seeing an ad stating that during a certain period of time, if children were placed in these certain places, 9 times out of 10, they were sexually abused and they need to come forward because there's a class action lawsuit. So more trauma is happening to the kids. They're being separated from each other. They're being separated from their mother, and then they're put in systems. In my case, my children were separated, but they were with family. But that didn't stop the abuse. That didn't stop the pain. Just because they were with family members. Because now you have family members who have had to take on extra mouths to feed, and they're already struggling, and now they're angry. And they're taking that anger and that frustration out on those little ones. But all in their mind, they're thinking they're doing the right thing by keeping them out of the system. Incarceration of the primary caregiver. Okay, let's try this. Let me just kind of help you picture a little bit more. I have a vignette here. The mother is arrested for a nonviolent drug charge. She's sentenced to 3 years. Her children are placed with relatives. But they begin to struggle at school. They act out. They shut down. Meanwhile, the mother is consumed with guilt, trying to parent through letters and a 15-minute phone call that costs several dollars for each call. That's not just her sentence. That's her children's sentence. Her entire family's sentence. Does you see how it rippled out? The school is starting to have problems. It's affecting the kids in the school, and they're acting out in school, which is causing somebody else's problems to be looped into a sentence that they have no idea about what's going on with this kid and why they're acting out. Because in the average black community, schools such as Detroit, where I am at, there's 32 other kids in that classroom. The teacher doesn't have time to focus on that one student or the backstory or understanding the layers of trauma. That doesn't happen. And I am speaking from a person who has lived this experience. That's why we call it voice to the voiceless. Because I'm not the only one. Let's look at another layer. And I welcome any comments, any questions. Tap into my website. Find us on YouTube, Spotify, Amazon. Check out the other ones, my other listings on YouTube. You'll even probably hear my oldest son's story of how his life crumbled as a college student when I got incarcerated. So let's go to the next one. The intersection of racism, sexism, and criminalization. The incarceration of Black women's lives at the crossroad of racism and sexism. Black women are historically stereotyped as dangerous, neglectful, and unworthy mothers. These stereotypes bleed into courtrooms, shaping harsher sentences. Absolutely. Black women I have carried these negative labels of being angry, again, neglectful, and unworthy of motherhood. But if you really look at the history of our country, and I'm going to go there, Black women nursed the master's babies. The Black women cared for and helped raise the master's children. Wow. The mistress was having tea with her friends and family. She was being a socialite. But the Black woman held those babies to their breasts and nursed them and fed them and raised them. But we are unworthy mothers. But we are neglectful. We have been taught to care for everyone throughout generations. It's passed down in our DNA to be caretakers because that's what we've been doing since the plantation, to be caretakers, not unworthy, not neglectful, and not dangerous. Go back and read your history. Labeling, another way of traumatizing, and giving stereotypes. Let me continue on to the intersectionality here. Black woman defending herself against an abusive partner is far more likely to be charged than a white woman in the same situation. And that is true. I had no prior nothing, never been in trouble, and I had a good job taking care of my children. 3 of them honor roll students, one going off to college. Didn't drink, didn't do drugs, but I got 10 years. Think about Centonia Brown, sentenced to life at the age of 16 for defending herself against a trafficker, someone who has taken her away from her family, who is selling her across this country at 16 years old. And they gave her life. Fortunately, enough people stood up and yelled and fussed that eventually her sentence was overturned and she was resentenced. Or look at Marissa Alexander, who was sentenced to 20 years just for firing a warning shot to protect herself. She didn't even hurt anybody. She didn't even touch the person, or they didn't bleed. There was no gun glaze. There was no bullet glaze. There was nothing. And she got sentenced to 20 years. And these aren't isolated cases. They reveal a system that criminalizes survival itself. Which, again, reflects on the racist overtone. Because many Black people are on survival mode because we are living in poverty. We have so many systems that are set up for us to survive or make it or live. And then when we try to survive, we move into being criminalized. I want to talk a little bit now about the emotional tolls of being behind the bars. We want to take a step inside the walls. And what's that like? Prison itself is traumatic. You got strip searches, solitary confinement, denied health care, and all of these re-traumatized women who are already survivors. I had to take a breath because, as many of you know, and I've said it multiple times, I was a first time offender that was sentenced to 10 years for protecting myself in an abusive relationship. And I never had experience being stripped down to nothing. No clothes, nothing. No socks, no shoes, no nothing. To be searched. When I came into the prison from a court date, from a hospital appointment, or from a visit with my family, it is the most humiliating thing that someone can experience. I've never experienced the solitary confinement, thank goodness, because I didn't get in trouble. I didn't do things. I didn't have contraband. I pretty much isolated a lot. I stayed to myself. I did connect with older people who were serving life sentences because they had been through all of the drama. They had seen it. They had been there 20, 30 years and they were settled. And we were into arts and crafts. And that's who I attached myself to. Women at the time, I was in my 30s and 40s, they were in their 60s and 70s and had been there 20, 30 years already. For again, surviving an abuser. So I never did that. But the denial of health care, there is not enough health professionals to be in there. So when you request for, or you have something physical or medical going on, if it's not urgent enough for them to pack you up and take you out of there in the EMS, you're going to wait at least 2 months to see a doctor. Imagine feeling sick and not being able to see anyone for professional help. Mental health support is minimum. I did have mental health support while I was there. I saw my therapist every 6 or 7 weeks. I saw the psychiatrist once a year. Um, Suicide attempts among incarcerated women are 9 times higher than the general population. Um, that I don't know, but yeah, I I had been there 6 months, and part of my journey prior to the 6 months, I had 4 suicide attempts. So yes, I did. I tried, but I was so naive. I didn't even know how to break down a disposable razor to be able to cut my wrist. And I wind up causing myself to get cut across my fingers, which took me out of there. Um, and yeah, cut some tendons in my hand. It's real. It's real. Suicide, the guilt the shame, the trauma. All of that plays a toll. And like and when therapy is available, we lean on each other. Um, we create peer support. We pray, we write, we find ways to survive. Like I spoke of the older women that I connected with. Yeah, we went to church together, we prayed together, we listened to gospel music together, we made meals together, we did arts and crafts together, and sometimes we sold it to each other or other inmates because that's how we were able to survive in there and buy things that we needed necessarily because we didn't want to ask our families for money because they're taking care of our children. They're already tapped out. So we found ways. And I connected with them because they've been doing it for 20, 30 years, 38 years. So I can learn how to survive the 10 years. But survival is not the same as healing. And a cage can never be a place of healing. So what could healing look like? So what's the alternatives? Healing looks like restorative justice, community-based healing, trauma-informed reentry services. That is what I'm about. That is what part of 313 Network Solutions vision, mission is to provide trauma-informed reentry. Because when it became time for me to re-enter, oh my God, a whole nother level of trauma. There are some groups out here like the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, and they are fighting for decarceration. Then there's the Essie Justice Group, is building a network of women with incarcerated loved ones, ending ending isolation and demanding change. These programs work. They reduce recidivism. They restore families. They recognize women not as criminals, but as full human beings. So here's some resources for the families and our listeners. And if this conversation touches your life or your heart, take a look at these resources. Again, Essie Justice Group, ESSIE, Essie Justice Groups. It's support for women with incarcerated loved ones. Then there's the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. They fight to change the policies and bring leadership. Then there's the Sentencing Project. They do research and advocacy on some of these harsh sentences. The National Resource Center on children and family of the incarcerated. There's guidance for families navigating this separation. There's support because it's hard. And then also take a look at SAMHSA, the substance abuse mental health part of our government. And they have a trauma informed care resource with free information for healing and support. And remember, you don't need a loved one in prison to make a difference. You can support bail funds, you can share stories, and challenge harmful narratives. Take a moment and check out those resources. Adopt a family at Christmas time through Angel Tree, who provide gifts to children on behalf of their mothers or fathers who are incarcerated. Check out Angel Tree. Support 313 Network Solution as we continue to do the work. Become a pen pal, a mentor, a visitor of an incarcerated person, especially a mother, especially Black mothers. I'm going to further the call to action because mass incarceration is not inevitable. It's a choice. And when it comes to Black women, that choice has too often been to punish survival instead of support survival. But like I said earlier, we can choose differently. We can push for decarceration. We can fight for trauma-informed systems and trauma-responsive systems, responding to the trauma that people already have to start a healing, not to punish. We can support reentry. We can shift how we talk about justice in our families, in our workplaces, in our communities, in our churches. Each of us has a role. And each role matters. Today, we looked at the realities of Black women in prison. And I'm going to close. The traumas that led us there, the family's impact, and the possibilities of healing. This is heavy, but it's also hopeful because Black women has always been at the center of healing in our community, in our nation, even under the heaviness of burdens, including slavery. Thank you for listening. Let's keep learning. Let's keep fighting. Let's keep imagining a world where justice means healing, not cages. And until next time, take care of yourself. and take care of one another.